Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. Today I'm going to kind of go over something that I was thinking about for a while. And this is like my top 5 fears about collecting comics. I know it sounds like a kind of a weird topic, but it's something like I think maybe all of us comic collectors kind of go through where we have these certain fears or concerns about the hobby in a way. And the first one, I think a lot of people can relate to, and especially during the hype stage of the collecting, where you see a book that you really want. A good example for me was, do I have it next to me? No, I don't. Was my Fantastic Four #5. I really wanted that book. That was like kind of a grail book. It's like the first appearance of Doctor Doom. And I just really was chasing after that book. I was going after that book. And every time I would go after it, it would just get a little bit more expensive. It was just constantly moving further and further out of reach. And I was like, oh man, am I ever going to get this book? And, you know, I ended up getting it, but I ended up having to buy a restored copy. And I went through so many hassles trying to get that book. So there's this feeling we call FOMO in the industry, that fear of missing out. And there is really, during the hype of the market, you really do feel that. You feel this that oh my goodness, is this book going to be going to be available? Is it going to be priced that I can afford? There's so many fears around that. And I think a lot of the hype that happened during 2020 and 2021 was really a lot of FOMO buying, where people were, I want to have this book in my collection, and they were just overspending to get it. And I fell victim to that too. I mean, it's a real fear that we have where we just don't want to miss out on a book. Now that I collect more Golden Age books, it's getting even worse, because a lot of these books that you buy in the Golden Age are ones that you don't see very often. Like maybe they'll come up for auction every 5 years. And so you have one chance in 5 years to buy a book. And it can be really disconcerting when you can't get it. Like when you can't get it, like, and the price, it's usually a new record when it comes up, because it's you gotta wait another 5 years to get it. So a lot of people, it's just one of those things where you feel like, oh, you're gonna miss out, and you don't want to overspend, but you don't want to miss out on the book, and it's really hard. And it only takes one other guy that has the same feeling of FOMO for them to bid up the book and make it go crazy. So that's one of the fears that we have as a collector, that we're going to miss out on some book. With the modern books, you don't get that as much because usually they're pretty readily available. But there can be that case. And so, I mean, I'm putting out my fears. I'd be curious what other people say, what their comments would be on these fears. I'd love to hear people's feedback, what your fears are. So that's my first one, FOMO, just that pure fear of missing out kind of thing. The next one is kind of like the reverse of that. So a lot of the time we buy books, we get all excited, the market goes up, and then the market can do the exact opposite. It can crash. And that's what we're experiencing right now. We're experiencing this really major crash in the market. And there becomes a new fear. A new fear is that we're afraid, and I have this fear all the time, like, are my books going to be worthless? I spent so much money on this book. I maybe paid $1,000 and now it's worth $20. Like that kind of fear that it's just going to be worthless. It's, at the end of the day, it's paper. Paper's not really worth that much. It was originally sold for 10 cents or whatever, it was at the time. So there's this fear that these books will become worthless. And sometimes, like, I see like a book, and I get annoyed actually when I go out and I buy like some expensive book, and I think, oh, that FOMO experience where you buy some expensive book and you think you're not going to see it ever again, and for some reason that same book comes out multiple copies, like just around that same time, and you end up being the one that had paid the most and other people got it for cheaper. And you're like, oh man, like, and you feel like right off the bat, you have that market correction feeling where you've overspent for something, and now is it going to be still worth that, in the future? And you see all these other books kind of crashing, like, how many Eternal Ones and how many like so many of these 90 books have really dropped in value, and you feel like, wow, did I overspend? Did I jump in when it was the wrong time? And also, like, as a collector, this is a real concern because you know even though I'm not planning to sell my books anytime soon, you get this feeling that for every dollar that I spend on one book, that's a dollar that is taken away from me getting some other book. So you only have so much money. So when you feel like you've kind of bought at the height of the market, then you feel like, oh, I've really missed out on having that extra money that I could have used to buy more books at a better price. so there's always that feeling of, is the market going to crash? Are these books going to be worthless? Especially, I imagine, for people that are flipping books, this can be a real concern. Also, like, this is our legacy. And, if 20 years from now, it's not worth anything, nobody's collecting comics in 20 years, you're always, is this, that's the fear that we have, that, like, are there going to be future generations that will take up the gauntlet of collecting comics? And that market crash can really make you feel nervous about it. Like, I remember during the 90s, and I feel like we're kind of going through a similar crash that happened during the 90s, where what happened in the 90s was the death of Superman. And the death of Superman was kind of a very eye-opening event that happened within the comic community. Because what happened was everyone was betting the bank on the death of Superman. They were buying long boxes, and they were going to be able to retire on that long box of the death of Superman. That they had so many copies of it, they'd be all worth $1 million, and they would be able to retire on that. And what ended up happening was those books became dollar bin books. They never really gained the value that people had expected they would. And they brought back Superman anyways, so really it's just a storyline at the end of the day, the death of Superman. It's not as important of an event as it was made out to be. And there was a lot of, like, hype that happened in the 90s where the market seemed like, oh, it was really growing. There was a lot of collectors that were jumping in thinking, oh, this is where I can make money. It's like a kind of the Klondike kind of experience where people were like seeing it as a gold rush. They're rushing to comics because it seemed like a great way to make money. You could buy comics at $1 and then sell them at $10, and there's just money all left, right, and center to be made in comics. And what happened is the market crashed. Sort of the death of Superman marked the death of comics. And a lot of shops went out of business. And when the shop would go out of business, they would take their inventory, they would dump it for cheap, and that would further destroy the market. And, like, it was just a real, real bad time. And as a collector, that can be very disconcerting because you feel like, oh my God, this is like, I've put in all this money and it's worthless. It's not going to be worth anything. And I spent X dollars and it's worth a fraction of that now. And you feel like, oh, what an idiot I am for ever thinking comics could be worth something. And what you had was, in the 90s, there was a real fear of that. And that's, it lasted for several years. It actually really, the whole market in general, it was slowly recovering, but it took until really the Marvel age, where a new Marvel age, I mean the MCU age, where that kind of turned around and you started getting collectors back in and getting the hype again, and people are getting excited about collecting comics again. And it was really, like, pretty harsh during those years in between. And so the point is, that is a big concern that this could happen again. And we're kind of experiencing that now, where you get a lot of people jumping in on the industry, and just as many that jump in on an industry can jump out of the industry. And that crash can really, really upset your ability to sell your books in the future. So just something that is a big fear of mine, a big fear, I think, for a lot of collectors. So something that I just think about a lot of the time. Another thing, this is kind of a weird one, and this is a real fear for collectors. And part of the reason why I grade all my books, you'll notice like I try to get like them in slabs as much as possible. And the reason for that is I have this fear of my comics getting destroyed in some way, like a flood or bugs or my children or my wife or just something happening to my books, or tape pulls. So many reasons where comics can get destroyed, and you're thinking about that. It's a sort of a fear that, oh, are my comics safe? Like, you know, or they could be stolen. There's so many things that can happen that makes you kind of afraid for your comics, that, you know, your comics can get destroyed in some way. And, you know, the funny thing is with comics, it's just like when you collect stamps or anything that's fragile, the slightest amount of damage can really affect the value of that comic. So the difference between a 9.8 and a 9.6, which is pretty much not much technical difference in terms of appeal of the comic, can be day and night in terms of price. It could be like 2 to 3 times more for a 9.8 than a 9.6. So damage, even on the slightest degree, can have huge impact on the value of your book. So there is that fear that, oh, if I get a little ding, if I when I put the book into the box, if it bends or something, you know, all of a sudden it's going to be a fraction of the value. So it's a real fear. I know it's, I've had so many times where I got in tape pulls. I just had this is a funny story. This just happened. I was like going crazy with this one book. So I realized that when I put one of the books into the long box, that it had kind of gotten pushed too far, so that the other book that was like in front of it was sitting on it, so that it kind of got bent at the very bottom of the book. So it's like, oh my goodness, how? So I didn't even realize that it was like that. And it was like that for like a month. I was like, oh man. So I took the book out. I noticed that the backing board was bent. The book had a bit of a curve to it because it was kind of bent. So I took it out, and then I replaced the backing board because I wanted it to be a nice flat backing board so it'd get straight again. I figured, if it gets pressed in the long box, it'll get straight again. But I don't know what I was doing, but when I took the book out, the tape actually grabbed the book. Typical situation where, I should have taken the tape off. I should have taken that extra step, just remove the tape from the bag. I didn't do that. I don't know what I was thinking. And the tape grabbed the book. So not only was the book bent, but now it had a potential tape pull. So I was like very delicately removing the tape from the book. Fortunately, the type of tape that I use doesn't stick to the comics. That it's pretty good for that. So I was able to remove it without any damage to the book. But it was one of those things like, oh my goodness, like, I'm going to destroy this comic that I actually really like, and I don't really want to destroy it. And it was already mangled from the way I put it in the box. And like, so it's just like so many things that, you think about how it impacts the value of the book, how it impacts the look of the book, how it impacts your feeling about the book. And so those fears of any kind of damage happening to your books, like, especially like another fear that I always have, like speaking of damage, is just bugs. Like, I'm always afraid of those little bugs that eat paper. That's a big fear of mine, that those little bugs that eat paper are going to come and, nibble on your pages or whatever it is. Like when I had my comic room in the basement, we would have little bugs in the basement. And I would be constantly like vacuuming and making sure that the room was bug free. But still, I'd find some in there, and I was always paranoid. Oh, they're gonna like chew my comics. So it's a big fear. you know, how can you maintain these comics for future generations, or even for your own lifetime? So just that fear of maintenance of the comics can be a real fear for comic collectors, I find. So just something I think about. I'm curious what other people feel about these fears that I have. The next one is a kind of an interesting one, kind of similar to the earlier ones. It's the fear of overpaying. Now, this happens a lot where you buy a comic and you think, oh, I got a really great price on it. And then you have a good friend that says, hey, I picked up the same book. I paid $100 for it. How much did you pay? And then you're like, oh, I paid $300 for it. It's like that fear of overpaying for something where, you never know, like, especially with Golden Age, what you like, as I said, these books might come up once every 5 years or even longer. Some I've seen on the census where it's been 10 years since there's been a sale. So you're trying to do your best to estimate, oh, this book would be currently worth this much. And, you try to do a little bit of math in your head to figure out what that book would be worth now. And you kind of give an offer based on that. And, it's a guess. It's a real guess. And, other people maybe better negotiators, maybe other people have done better, analysis, or maybe the people selling haven't done that proper analysis and you can get a better deal. So there's always that fear of overpaying. And, I kind of going back to the FOMO a bit, I've seen it where there's like this thing where a book becomes hot, okay? And normally when a book becomes hot, what ends up happening is the price kind of goes out of your range. It, can go double, triple what it was before it was hot. And even if you buy at that beginning price, you can have this weird experience happen where there's no other comics listed, so you basically bought it at what you thought was a fair price because there's just no other choice. There's only the one copy, that's it. But I've seen it where the following happens. A book gets hot and then there's like a whole bunch of copies that get listed because everyone's like, oh, I want to cash in now that the book is hot. And then because so many listings happen, it actually goes below what the original price was. And had I just waited for the book to actually get hot, and for it then to get cool, those books would still be on the market, and then the price kind of drops below what you paid when there was only one copy on the market. I know it's a really weird way of explaining it, but that's something that I've seen happen over and over again. Like a book will get hot, and all of a sudden the market gets flooded with copies. And then, the market gets cool again. Nobody's talking about that book. They've moved on to the next big book. And all of a sudden you have all these copies where people are like, oh, I can't sell them now. And they'll drop the price because they still have them on the market. And, they're still trying to get rid of them. And then the price will actually go below what it was before the comic even got hot. So it's kind of interesting, and it'll correct a little bit after that. But the point is, like, there's sort of this weird little potential for buying it cheaper than when you bought it at that initial price. And I've seen that happen a few times. It happens more with the modern stuff. The Golden Age, you're not going to see that as much. But when it's like bronze and more recent stuff, you can see that a lot. I remember the comic, I'm trying to remember which comic it is actually. Renslayer, the girl from the Thor movie, Thor TV series, the Loki TV series. you know, her book got really, really hot around the time the Loki series came out, and I actually tried to buy it before before it got hyped up, and I forgot what I paid. I think I paid $50 or something like that, and it actually went up to several hundred during the hype, and then a whole bunch of copies got onto eBay, and about 6 months after the show was done, the same copy was maybe like $40. Like he kind of, because there was just too many comics competing with each other at that point, and the prices dropped. So there's that market correction that happened. It's recovered since, but it's just sort of one of those things where you can see these kind of weird fluctuations, just because so many copies they're out there. You just need some hype to bring those copies onto the market, and once they flood the market, then there actually creates a buying opportunity. So it's kind of weird how that works, but there's always that fear of overpaying where you don't know when is the best timing for when to buy that book, because sometimes it's the opposite case where a book gets hot and it just stays hot. It just never comes back down to what it was at the beginning. So had you just bought it at the beginning, you would have been fine. So you never know. And it's like always that fear. Did I buy it at the right time? Should I have waited? There's always that fear. And it kind of goes with FOMO a bit, that you don't, you fear of missing out, but also the fear of overpaying. And the last of my five my five fears about comic books and fears about comic collecting is the following. It's kind of an interesting one. This is like, I've built up this massive collection, and I really do love my collection. And I always, this is kind of my fear. Like, I want to have that legacy where my kids will, eventually have these as their collection. And there's that fear especially as a parent, where you're worried that, will my kids have the same passion for the hobby that I do? And there's that real fear that when you pass, and we all are going to pass sometime, that you have nobody to give it to that will appreciate it as much as you do. I mean, a lot of the time, like a lot of collectors will say this, and I've heard this so many times, where they will consider their collection not as something that their next generation will enjoy, but as something that they'll get the money from it. It's just going to be a pure money thing, that they'll have to sell it all and they'll get the money from it, and that's the legacy that you'll leave. But one of my fears is really kind of a combination of, will the market be strong when they sell? Will they know how to sell? Like I try to educate them on that. But, that's one fear, that they won't know how to sell it properly and they won't get the best value from it. And then the second element is, what I'd rather have happen is that they don't sell it at all, that they just enjoy it. They look at the books with the same love and excitement that I look at the books with. When I see one of these books, I'm like, oh man, that's so cool. I'm so happy to have that in my collection. And I'd kind of like them to have that same excitement. Now, to be honest, when you buy something for yourself, you're always going to have more excitement than anyone else. It's just the way it is. Like, because you've earned the money, you worked hard to get that book, you've done the hunting. There's a lot to that where you appreciate it more just because of the journey that it took to get that book. And when your kids get it, well, if you're just passing it on, you say, here's a book, it's not as exciting. It's just, there isn't that buildup that you experienced getting the book. And as a result, there's never going to be that legacy that you really want. The ultimate legacy is for your kids to just love the books and get excited every time they see them. And sadly, that might not be the case. And that's one of the fears that I have, that my kids won't love the books as much as me, and they won't enjoy the hobby as much as I do. And I'm actually always worried about the legacy even beyond my family, beyond my periphery of people that could potentially get these books. That there might not be a future generation that's interested in comic collecting. Back to the market, is there going to be a market 20, 30 years or 40 years in the future when these books would all of a sudden be on the market, right? It's one of those fears. So legacy is kind of one of those things I always think about. What is going to be my legacy? Is it just going to be a burden to my kids where they're like, oh, how do we get rid of all these comics, and then they sell them for $1 a piece, and then just treat them like they're worthless? Or will there even be a market for them to sell them? Are they just going to see them as like something, oh, we just take it to the dump? Like just that level, like where, or, are they going to appreciate the books? So there's just that fear. And so I just love, having these kind of discussions, like putting these ideas out there. I don't want to make anyone afraid of comics, and like I actually want people to love and, enjoy comics, but I just wanted to kind of maybe a little bit of therapy here. I'm just putting out my, I feel like I should lie down on the couch and say, oh, this is what I'm afraid of, blah, blah, blah. Like that kind of therapy session. But I feel like if we kind of express our fears and get them out there, then they can't kind of control us. So I always like to have that out there, and then you can address those fears. So what do you guys think? What are your fears about comic collecting? And what do you think of the fears that I said? Do you share any of the same fears as what I have? I'd love to hear people's opinions on this. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Bye for now.